Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I am very pleasantly surprised that we filled a room at 9 o'clock in the morning on the vital, but sometimes poorly thought of topic of carbon accounting, greenhouse gas accounting. We have an absolutely stellar group of folks here to discuss the latest in the future of greenhouse gas accounting here today. Before we get started, though, I just want to begin by saying an enormous thanks to the Aspen team, both the Aspen Ideas team and the incredible Energy and Environment team for hosting yet another amazing Aspen Ideas Climate, and delighted that they've found a new home for the event this year in Chicago, and obviously ordered up some fantastic weather for us while we're here. I say as someone coming from very swampy Washington, D.C., where I'm this feels very, very cool and relaxing relative to D.C. Delighted to be here. I'll be the moderator today. Rich Powell, I'm the CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Association and the Clean Energy Buyers Institute. On behalf of our 400 members, all of the largest buyers of electricity in the United States and increasingly around the world, we care a lot about this issue, because this issue is how we keep track of our progress on the goals and commitments we have made to decarbonize our electricity supply. In the parlance of greenhouse gas accounting, that's our Scope 2 emissions, the emissions that come from our electricity. And so we're very, very engaged in this topic and in its evolution and its future. I'll offer a few just quick remarks before I introduce our amazing group here. So obviously, why we're all gathered here this week is to acknowledge that more action and more ambition is needed as we all collectively work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and scale up clean electricity and clean energy of all kinds all around the world. Clearly in DC, we're facing some headwinds on that topic. And so the CEBA, for example, has been very, very involved in what became the One Big Beautiful Bill and the ramp down of many of the incentives for many of the technologies that we'll talk about today. So the policy headwinds are non-trivial now, in the US at least, as we go forward on this. And yet the private sector continues to demonstrate remarkable leadership, and it is because of greenhouse gas accounting and reporting. So even with full absence of a federal policy regime, the commitments that so many of our members at CEBA and so many other companies that Mindy works with at Ceres and other things have driven enormous progress. Just as one example, as of Q2 of this year, CEBA's membership in the United States alone has contracted for 116 gigawatts of carbon-free electricity projects in the US, more than 250 gigawatts around the world. If you're not an electricity nerd like Secretary Moniz, to give you a sense of scale, that would be by far a fuels nerd like Secretary Moniz. To give you a sense of scale, that would be by far the largest state in the US. That sort of blows California or Texas out of the water. It's sort of becoming almost the size of a power pool. It's more than the size of the Italian entire electricity market, just the pooled demand for clean energy for CEBA members today, and that's growing fast. And it's all because, again, of the background infrastructure that carbon accounting enables. And so this morning, we want to talk about what this infrastructure is today and how it needs to evolve in the future, what the current benefits and strengths are, how that process today, especially the greenhouse gas protocol, is being updated, and the new ideas and new regimes that are being suggested that would maybe allow a broader suite of different kinds of approaches to decarbonizing our energy systems to be accounted. This is a big, complex space. I'm not going to go into all of the specific details in this, but suffice it to know that there are a number of different voluntary regimes that set up this market as it exists today, and others potentially in formation, probably the very largest ones being the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is established and maintained by World Resources Institute and the World Council on, or WBCSD, and built on top of that, both the Carbon Disclosure Project, which people report into using that framework, so you can sort of look up everybody's Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, and then the World Wildlife Fund's SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, where people take that accounting and then set a goal about how they're going to reduce their emissions, and many other things in between, but those are some of the largest ones in the landscape. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our amazing set of discussants here to start this conversation. So seated to my left, obviously, is Mindy Luber, the CEO of Ceres, followed by Secretary Ernie Moniz, former Secretary of Energy, now head of both EFI, the Energy Futures Initiative, and the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And of course, Senator Heidi Heitkamp, former senator of the great state of North Dakota, and now chair of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. So I'm going to start with a very, very high-level question for each of you. What is working well about the current carbon accounting system, and how do you think it needs to evolve for the future? Can I turn to you?
Sure. And I run an advocacy organization, but work directly with about 150 large companies and 190 investors, small, medium, and large investors, trying to integrate climate risk as a material financial risk into everything they do, so at the boardroom and throughout. So it's a lot of push and shove, but that's what I do, and we'll answer this in this context. I mean, this world has gotten like everything else. I'm not talking the politics of this world. We've got voluntary standards. We've got systems. We've got things like the Carbon Disclosure Project. We've got things like CSRD, mandatory standards in Europe. I want to separate them out and then quickly answer the question. Disclosure is crucial, and we need to have disclosure before we get to what are the standards for reporting. In Europe, they're now mandatory. After literally 15 years of tedious work at the SEC, where we got the SEC to mandate the disclosure of climate risk, a 500-page rule came out with appendix, and it was pulled back in 15 minutes after the new administration got in. So we've got to think about this all in a global fashion. The United States may not be keeping up now. Hopefully by some years we'll be keeping up, and it'll keep going. So we've got standards, voluntary and mandatory, depending on where you are. We've got systems for accounting, the greenhouse gas reporting protocol, and some new ones coming out. This is how I evaluate them, just to answer your question spot on. I mean, first of all, I barely touched on the acronyms. So, you know, we could sit here and go through
it's a complex space.
ISSB, the international standard. I'm definitely not going to put you back to sleep with all of that. The bottom line is we need to do what is going to have an impact and what's doable over time. I am the ultimate pragmatist when I look at what's going on with climate. It is a runaway train. It is moving forward. Emissions are going up, and we need to think about what we're doing from several perspectives. One, globally. Two, what's going to have the greatest impact. Three, what's doable. If it took us 12 or 13 years, and again, I'm a former regulator. I know it's hard to draft regulations, as it was with the SEC to have mandatory climate risk disclosure, but that's got to be considered. So if it's going to take another 15 years to come out with a new global reporting standards, I'm not in. And then finally, the impact on those who are users. So given what is turning out to be a debate out there, the greenhouse gas protocol versus the e-liabilities carbon accounting system, I come down for incredibly practical reasons. You know, on my side as a nerd or a lawyer, I might say, this one's better with this way and this one's better. We've got a standard. It's working well. Thousands and 10,000 companies are using it. Is it perfect? No. Let's fix it. Let's moderate it. Let's do what it takes. But starting over and going through an international consultation process and drafting and redrafting and doing new regs for a more perfect system, I'd rather our perfect system energy go into what is it absolutely going to take to bring those emissions down, and that's what we've got to be focused on.
Thanks. Ernie?
Well, I'm going to start out by somewhat disagreeing with my neighbor, Mindy.
Spice it up in the morning.
Neighbor means that we literally live a few hundred feet apart.
In Brookline, Massachusetts.
In Brookline, Massachusetts. I mean, I certainly agree with I agree with your proposition about, first of all, it's really important to move forward and to build, to use some of the tools that have been constructed. But there are also areas where we think that we just need some additional tools. For example, and we may talk more about a completely, really boring subject about how we are suggesting moving forward with a carbon accounting system, which actually I will say, which we feel must be, especially at the product level, as opposed to the enterprise level, based upon the kinds of structures that have evolved over a century in financial accounting. What we do today in our carbon accounting, or carbon counting, or carbon accounting, we can argue about those distinctions as well, really does not follow that kind of tool development. And I want to emphasize that when we talk about financial accounting and GAAP rules and all of that, there are slight variations around the world. Number two, they are not static. Every year there are updates that come out through some entity, which is one of the problems that Mindy correctly points to. But it is a language that is understood basically globally in terms of how you account for the financial status, the financial directions, the financial health of different organizations. Now, as we go to where I think we all want to go, to an economy that understands how to value financially carbon content, carbon engagement in products. By the way, when I say products, I just kind of include services in there as well. That we are going to have to, we think, add another system. It can be rolled up to the entity level, but it has to have a product level capability. It has to consider all the stocks and flows of carbon, including carbon in different molecular configurations, and their conversions. And it has to have well-defined boundaries in both space and time, which is, again, a characteristic of financial accounting. And I think that we have a lot more, shall we say, looseness in various approaches that are prevalent today. So we believe that many of the approaches used today in various ways can still be employed for certain kinds of accounting, but not when it comes down to really hard-nosed, especially product-level accounting of stocks and flows of carbon through the entire supply chain that is transactional. It follows the supply chain with all the information contained in a ledger. And then totally policy agnostic, technology agnostic. Frankly, some of the methods out there today have been created in service of a policy outcome. We say, no, we just need a tool. I know it's boring. Auditors are well known as accountants without the personality, but we need to go in this direction and have a pure, simple, reduced to practice ledger approach for tracking stocks and flows of carbon, as I said, within well-defined boundaries.
And as this debate is going on about how best to do accounting, there's a whole nother debate is, why the hell would you do it? Who cares? And that's kind of where I come into this discussion, which is the desperate need for stability in policy, the desperate need for a continuing commitment, whether it is to carbon accounting, whether it is to the reporting that you might do. And then the question becomes, will the United States of America, which is what I'm probably most familiar with, will they ever reach a mandated standard reporting system? Because you have seen, I would just do a comparison on the DEI discussion that's going on in corporate America. Okay, corporate America is told that's woke, and you don't want to raise your head above politically, right? You don't want anyone to think that you're a woke corporation, or you paint a big target on your back. And so you change your language. Harvard's doing it. Institutions all across this country are saying, look, we know that this might be a temporary kind of change in terms of policy. We don't see the lack of inclusion and equity ever going away in terms of how shareholders may judge us, how employees may judge us, but we have to have a real world discussion today about what it means to be perceived. Okay, so that's in the DEI space. The climate space has become the new woke discussion, right? That it's an unnecessary additional burden. It is, as I say, not drill baby drill, it's burn baby burn, right? And so the question becomes, if it's not mandated, if it's not a system that is required. I mean, gap accounting is required for everyone. I mean, it's applied voluntarily because everybody wants to have that measurement that they can talk to their shareholders about, they can talk to their investors about, and everybody understands that language. And today in the early stages, and I would say gap accounting, evolved over decades, if not centuries. We are in the early stages, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do corrections, but it does mean that it is critically important to have a standard that everyone recognizes that has legitimacy. Why is that? Because you aren't going to get investors without legitimacy. You aren't going to get buy-in without legitimacy. And that's why, at the risk of sounding like I'm sucking up, the work that Ernie's doing is so critical because there's no one else doing. There you go. I finally said something nice about you, Ernie. We've been together for 2 days. It took us this long to say something nice about each other. So it now is important that in the background and in those discussions that may not be public, that we are continuing this work, because there will come a time when it has legitimacy. And in one thing we haven't talked about, and God forbid that anyone would be ever on a panel in America today without talking about AI, right? Because it is like the favorite discussion. But the ability to really drill down and use a lot of data and analyze a lot of data very quickly, correct mistakes very quickly, is upon us. Which means that when we are looking for legitimacy, and I'll give you an example. So we have a company in North Dakota, and a lot of the work that I've done in this space is obviously in agriculture, and recognizing that a lot of people think that natural climate solutions other than planting a tree are just bunk, right? Retaining carbon in soils, that's just some phoniness that will create another income stream for big farmers, right? Who can afford to do the accounting. I am convinced that with the right kind of technology and the right kind of commitment by farmers, adapters, and the right kind of economic incentives, that you can, in fact, use 90% of the land mass in a state like North Dakota that's engaged in production agriculture to actually address the climate challenges. But how do you legitimize it, and how do you account for it, and how do you make sure that you are not greenwashing your credit? And so we have a company called Bushel. What is Bushel? Bushel has the ability to basically take something that's incredibly fungible, like a bushel of corn, and basically identify a bushel of corn based on the kind of carbon inputs. That was why they were created kind of in the beginning. They don't do that work. They don't do that work because there's no economic incentive to do that work. And so this has to be, I think, as this work is done intellectually to develop a system of credit accounting, you also have to look at the public policy that's going to drive the demand for more carbon accounting and the ability to reward, whether that is intangible rewards to your shareholders or whether that's real economic awards in terms of selling carbon credits on a market, for farmers, let's take farmers again, you have to have an economic incentive to do this. And I think without stability in policy, we're going to keep doing this peaks and valleys. You know, it's like hurry up and get it done. Nope, don't do it, hide what you're doing. If you're still making a commitment to sustainability or to carbon reduction, don't tell anyone because that's in the bad category now. And so to me, the accounting will require a lot of intellectual input. The policy is going to require a lot of grassroots advocacy. And that's going to have to be driven by economic incentives.
Mindy, did you want to?
So I just wanted to respond to a few of the points you made, and I agree with it. One is we do need policy. Ultimately, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd say we should have a price on carbon. And if I could raise the wand again, I'd say that would be a consistent price around the world. Well, there are no real mechanisms for having one consistent price. That said, we all ought to be pushing for it. That will help define the cost of carbon and what it means and the impact. In the United States, I'm probably not going to wish on a star for the next couple of years, but we got to come back to it. In response to what you said, though, and that's why I said I often come back to being a pragmatist. What's going to help us move the needle and move it forward? And if this weren't this administration, I'd be saying, let's go back to a price on carbon. But that is just not going to happen. Right now, this world of woke capitalism, Leonard Leo, a guy who brought us the Supreme Court, who pledges $1 billion to stop woke capitalism, to him it means anything companies and investors are doing that's what he will call value-driven, even though climate risk, and I would argue diversity as well, climate risk is a material financial risk to the markets, to companies, to investors, and they need to be included in it. That said, last year there were 146 bills to prohibit it in state legislatures, 10 in the Congress. This year there are 130 bills, some of them more bizarre than you can imagine, prohibiting farmers from talking about climate risk and what it means to them and reporting on weather standards. So we're in a world right now where, I testified before Jim Jordan of the Judiciary Committee, turned over 96,411 documents, $1 million in legal fees, just on why climate risk is a material financial risk and belongs in the financial domain. What we're seeing from companies and investors and meeting with them and talking to them, I would argue every day, is exactly what you said. They do want to move forward. They don't want to do it publicly. They want to do it quietly. They do want goals, but they want them to be looser. They do want goals, but they don't want them to be transparent. Similar in the investor community, slightly different standards. And so that's the world we're working in right now. And I could kick and scream and say, no, you got to be transparent and you got to stand up and scream and yell and sign on to this plan. It's not where the capital market players are right now. And so when I go back to starting with, we've got a greenhouse gas protocol. Is it perfect? No. Does it need updating and different standards? Yes. It's not that I don't think we might need a different accounting system, but when I think about how to move the needle and what to do now, today, yesterday, tomorrow, I think, and again, we could chew gum and walk at the same time. People could be developing accounting standards, but we really need to be focusing on what is going to move companies and investors. How do we get companies to sign on to the Science-Based Targets Initiative? So they're setting goals. How do we make sure that they're living into those goals and moving? They're coming up with a climate action plan, which we hope to make mandatory, but still now is very voluntary. And with that, there'll be better data, there'll be more information, there'll be more action. And again, if accounting standards change or need to change or those discussions need to be happening, I'm all for it. But we've got enough now, I think, to dig in and focus on the how do we move the needle tomorrow? What more could we be doing? 10,000 companies use science-based targets. That's a lot of companies who have set out to do something. There are many who want to get rid of that and come up with a new system. I don't want to think about how long it will take us to get to 10,000 companies to sign up to the new system. Now, science-based targets was pretty narrow and would not consider carbon credits and what to do. And I think over the last year, we've been able to change that and get that aperture to open. So the systems in place are doing the things you're talking about and that are necessary. Again, I'll always come down on the how do we move the needle on emissions, how do we be most pragmatic, and how do we look at this issue globally? My final word is I just came back from Singapore, where I spent time with Temasek, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and they convened 800 investors around climate. Every one of them are full speed ahead, and every one of them are looking for policy. So what we're doing here in the United States, which of course is shameful and depressing, and the world is moving forward. So everything we think about, we ought to be doing at a global perspective. And eventually, we've got to hope the U.S. catches up.
Well, I have to add, Rich. We still have a little opening angle here. Because look, clearly, I'm guessing that everyone in this room completely agrees, certainly on this stage, everyone agrees, that we have to keep moving the needle as soon as we can. We're not doing as much as we should, but as fast as we can. There's no doubt about it. And there's no doubt that a lot of companies are, with various levels of honesty and enthusiasm, moving forward in trying to position themselves for a world where one way or another carbon in the supply chain and the value chain is valued. There's no question about it. And there's no question that we certainly would not argue in our accounting efforts, for example. We certainly wouldn't argue, stop the trains for 10 years while we get this right and get 10,000 companies signed up. Hell no, I never said that. What we are saying is that there are missing tools and that there are a whole bunch of policy activities, carbon border adjustments. It's pretty hard to do without a very serious product level carbon accounting scheme, which investors understand what the rules were for making that ledger, for making the transfer of that information. Policies, as you've said, Mindy, and I think Heidi in effect said the same thing, that we are going to have, at least for a long time, the great global carbon price we can dream about, perhaps, although frankly, on another panel, we should argue that as well, because I have some problems with the implementability of that, actually. Yeah. That's another interesting story. But we're going to have policy variations in many, many places. We're going to have companies acting very differently. Look, today, let's face it, companies in Europe and companies in the United States don't all exactly behave the same way for obvious reasons. There's a policy backdrop to this, and clearly in the developing world, the emerging economies quite different again. So again, what we're saying is, we're going to have to evolve a ledger-based system that is policy neutral, but that can be used in any policy context in order to advance whatever that company or country or region wants to do. So that's what we're talking about. It's not about stopping the trains. It's not about not using some of the tools that are some of the approaches that are there today. It's that we've got a giant gap. And I don't mean G-A-A-P, right. I mean G-A-P, although we have a giant gap in both senses, I guess. What we're talking about is, let's get back in a way that can be reduced to practice. There's a lot of academic literature on this. You mentioned e-liability, and we draw pretty heavily on some of the e-liability work, for example. Not entirely. We have some differences, but draw upon it. But there's an urgent need to start the process of also reducing a ledger-based kind of system to practice. And that's why, actually, within a couple months, we plan to publish not just more on the overall methodology, but 6 case studies, SAF, power sector. And some of these when I say, because I share your pragmatism, frankly, for some of them, there are going to be some quasi-arbitrary choices that have to be made. Take the power system and applying a whole supply chain approach. Oh yeah, well, where did that electron come from that I just used? You know, how do you draw the boundary? So we're going to have a rules-based system, and some of those rules are going to be put forward in the service of being reasonable and of being well-defined and implementable. So that's really the objective that we are pursuing. And if I may just add one thing, it's just a totally different subject, but Heidi reminded me. In your early statements about the kind of the political karma, a statement made by a very wise Chicagoan, who we'll identify in a second, who made the remark in a different context, but I think it can be applied to climate, and it can be applied to accounting, namely Barack Obama. I think it was in late November of last year, maybe it was December, he said something like, among other things, purity has never been a very effective way of getting things done. That's the pragmatism part. And we better stop talking only to the woke. The unwoke have views as well. So anyway, I think there's a little bit of a lesson there about how we're trying to get a practical, implementable system.
So we have covered a lot of ground here. We've covered incremental change versus revolutionary change. We've covered why you would do this in the first place and what the driving mechanisms are. By the way, I will note in that an additional driving mechanism on top of investors, on top of policy, are the folks at the top of supply chains demanding this of the rest of the supply chain. So obviously, SEBA, the Clean Energy Buyers Association's members, many of whom have met their first carbon goals, are now going out to their scope 3, so their supply chains, and saying, oh, you manufacturer of the chips that power our devices, for example, I'm noticing that a lot of the electricity going into those semiconductor plants in Southeast Asia is coal-fired electricity. We'd really like you to change that and work on your policymakers to change that. So lots of mechanisms, a sea of different mechanisms, but definitely some sense of a need for a central coordinating function. In a moment, I'm going to open it up to the audience. So folks, start framing your brilliant, insightful questions. I'm going to ask Heidi one last question. And so you mentioned credibility in this space. Working with conservative policymakers, a significant critique of the existing system has been that today only zero emission technologies get credit in the existing system.
Right.
And so, for example, things like carbon capture, which I know is near and dear to your heart, and you worked so heavily on, especially in your time in the Senate around that, currently don't get you, if you reduce 99% of the emissions from a power plant, because it's not 100% of the emissions, there's today arguably no way to get credit for that in the current system. So that has been a credibility problem, a credibility constraint in the current system. And I wonder, how do you think these systems could improve their credibility with a broad, not just conservative policymakers, but maybe the broader public? How do we get at this credibility?
Well, I think it is so important that we build a much broader coalition than simply people who will always, and I think Ernie just alluded to this, who will always see good as the enemy of perfect and will stop at no cost to basically say, we cannot, if it's a fossil fuel, pox on your house, there will be no development, there will be no infrastructure. You know, I can show you an example in Maine that desperately, when it gets really cold in Maine, you know how they generate electricity with diesel fuel. Number one, it's highly inefficient, highly polluting, and it has a huge carbon footprint. They could build a natural gas line, but it's 22 miles through Massachusetts, and that natural gas line has been stopped because it is a fossil fuel. And so when you are a conservative and you are looking at the relative balance of carbon, you say, wait a minute, that makes absolutely no sense. You're unwilling to do this because you have a hatred, an emotional hatred of fossil fuels. Because if you look at it, the United States has made progress on reducing our carbon footprint. Most of that has come from the conversion from coal to natural gas. I mean, you can show you the numbers, and if you look globally, deploying natural gas globally would have a huge impact if you could keep it affordable. And so this idea that, as I say, when you're doing this work, and Ernie, it's interesting because I have a friend, his name is Ernie Schneider. He wrote a book called The War Below. I don't know if any of you ever read it. It's about critical minerals. And at the end, he has a really enlightened discussion about what is the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle when you're replacing old cars, combustion cars, and you're transporting these critical minerals, and you're using an incredible amount of energy to mine them and process them. And at what point do you get to accounting that has legitimacy? Because if you're a conservative, there is tons of holes that you can poke in all of this dialogue. And it just seems to me that if I could set one policy, it would be an overall carbon reduction goal and just leave it up to the market to decide how you're going to get there. And so to me, I think that the most important thing you can do in response to your question is legitimize the criticism. To acknowledge, yeah, you're right. That's not working the way it should. How do you expect we should make this work? And the bottom line is, you know and I know that they are using that as evidence against a policy they have no desire to ever implement, because it's not within their political, judgment to political wherewithal or ability to get reelected to acknowledge this problem, even though, just like a lot of other things in Congress, they'll whisper about the challenges. And so, to me, I think having a legitimate discussion and acknowledging legitimate criticisms of accounting systems, of what we are currently doing, and trying to push back against the people who would always make perfect the enemy of good.
Okay, what questions do we have in the audience? Okay, I see. Let's actually let's do 3 at a time. Are we gonna do mics around to folks? So I saw Greg had hand up here first in the audience. Maybe we could do these first 3 kind of at a zigzag here, and then we'll kind of batch and respond.
Hi.
And can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Nitesh Bajaj. I work for a company called AMP Americas that's in the renewable natural gas space. And my question was around how you think about, it kind of goes to the pragmatism, but gap accounting will continue to always be used because there'll always be companies trading flows back and forth, and to some degree with carbon, but over time, if we all do this right, you should need a lot less carbon accounting. And so I'm curious how you think about that. And the example might be in the power system, if we were to set a clean electricity standard across the United States, then you would have zero carbon accounting need in that sector by 2050 or whatever the goal is, versus setting up these complicated rules. So you're just curious how you think about that difference in goals, and maybe it differs across sectors.
Super interesting question. Can we go to Greg here for one, and then there was maybe right in the hat.
Thanks. Great discussion. Greg Bertelson, Climate Leadership Council. 2, I think, related questions. The first is, first a premise. I think this has to be driven by corporations to solve a problem, and you all have perspectives and all work with companies. So I'm curious as to your level of optimism in terms of uptake for carbon accounting. And then second is how far can we get without U.S. policy? How far can we get towards a full gap-like accounting system for carbon accounting without ultimately the intervention of the U.S. government?
Great, thanks. We'll take one more.
Hi, I'm also Greg. Greg Bohr from Walmart, and I have a question about the conflict between voluntary actions and onerous accounting. We want companies to take action. We want them to address carbon and other risks in their supply chains, but it is a voluntary basis right now. There is not a policy that is forcing anybody to do this. And so if we have accounting measures that increase the costs of doing this work, right? You're taking intent and you're bumping it against potentially putting companies who are doing the work at a competitive disadvantage, because you may have one person doing the work and 10 people watching over their shoulder to make sure they did it in the right way and make the right claim and did the right accounting. I have huge concerns about product level accounting in that way. We have 10,000 stores across the world, 29 countries. A supercenter may have 140,000 products on its shelves, most of which have ingredients or manufactured by suppliers that we don't know exactly what's in it, right? I don't know what's in a bag of late night cheeseburger Doritos. I don't think anybody does. But we certainly don't know the volume of any particular ingredient mix, including the bushels of corn that's in there. So how can we ask for that accounting when we, right next to it, also have a private brand that we own, that's Walmart owned, that's competing with it, right? This is competitive information now that needs to be shared. And on a voluntary basis, how do we get to accounting rules that drive credible, impactful action across the supply chain on a crisis, but do not impose onerous burdens on those who are doing this on a voluntary basis?
So super interesting set of interrelated questions there. I think maybe we'll start with that last one about are there diminishing marginal returns from either, and I'm just going to, in a broad way, make you all representatives of evolution in the current system versus a revolutionary new system, if that's okay. So there are critiques in the evolution of the current system around the greenhouse gas protocol that go to higher and higher granularity, 24/7 accounting, tighter market boundaries, those sorts of things, kind of the direction that the existing system is moving. And Ernie, you're proposing a new system which would go all the way down to product level accounting. I guess I'd love to ask for both of you, is the juice worth the squeeze in these tighter, more sophisticated, more granular accounting methodologies? Are we actually going to get significant additional carbon reduction benefits and uptake out of the voluntary markets? And then we'll explore the question of how far can we go in the voluntary markets? And then we'll explore the really interesting question of shouldn't we really just be focused on policy, and why are we building this whole voluntary carbon accounting system when really policy would make it all irrelevant? So three great questions. But can we start just around kind of, let's call it like the tighter or more granular systems? Why do we need to go in those directions? Why is this actually going to increase carbon reductions overall if we go in those directions?
So my quick response is better information is good. That's why Ceres was founded on the Global Reporting Initiative, more disclosure of sustainability. That's why we spent 12 years on the SEC rule. Better information is good. The question is how to get it. The reality is I don't disagree with my neighbor or colleague, and disagreeing with Ernie is a mistake because he's a lot smarter than me, that we ought to be developing things to have better disclosure standards, better accounting. In the meantime, though, we got to be moving forward, and we need to do it in a practical way. I'm with you, Heidi, in that even in my years as a regulator, we stopped every project in the world. It almost didn't matter if there was a project we all got. That's got to go. We've got to be able to move energy from one part of the grid to the other. We have got to be able to look at things differently. So there's an enormous amount to focus on right now. Better information, great. Let's get it out there. And a lot of thinking going on around it, that's great. In the meantime, we do have, let's get companies to use science-based targets, set goals, and put in place climate action plans that tell you how they're going to meet their goals. I do think that, and I know this I think you got to get to mandatory. It's not easy right now in this place called the United States. But your question about why should Walmart do it and somebody else not do it, if the Fortune 100, everybody's all over the place, it doesn't exactly provide the incentives for Walmart to continue to be a leader. So, but are we going to get to new mandatory standards? Probably not right now.
So I certainly agree with what Mindy just said. Going back to the question directly, look, let's again go back to the analogy of financial accounting, which really started in the Depression. You know, tough financial times. Nobody could understand what what a company was doing, and it started out. It was not a mandatory, you know, economy-wide activity. It built up over time. And eventually today, look, even today in the United States, I believe this is true, that, you know, the mandatory part about, you know, GAAP and all of this and your favorite auditors and the like, that's required of public companies. But private companies, virtually all of them, also do it. They may hire a smaller auditor if they're a smaller company, et cetera, but they fundamentally do the same thing, because without it, they have a hard time playing in the economy, attracting the investments, et cetera. And the same is going to be true here if, and this is the big if where the policy comes in, if carbon is going to be valued. If you're a company and you want to distinguish your products, in terms of their carbon history, et cetera, there will be pressure coming from those companies. For example, a downstream company, you're seeing it today, are going back and asking their suppliers, what was your carbon history? Well, what we're saying is, let's regularize this with a ledger that is transparent, double entry bookkeeping. You can argue whether you want that or not. You know, there's details, but fundamentally a ledger that can be handed at every transaction across a spatial and temporal boundary is what will define this. Ultimately, it is about, in my view, the players in the economy, companies in particular, wanting to be in this game either because they are required or because they just want to be in the game. They want to differentiate their products. And the last thing I'll say on that is we should not forget that we are dealing, despite what's happening today in this country in particular, we are dealing and we are going to be dealing with a global economy. Markets are going to look a little bit different in different places, but I think anybody who's betting on there not being big, low carbon value markets globally is making a really bad bet, because we've already got them. In fact, on a separate issue, I would just note, we hear a lot about energy dominance. It's pretty hard to be energy dominant if you're not even playing in huge global markets. So I think there are going to be a lot of forces, as long as the world really is seeing the impacts of global warming, the extreme weather and everything else, and is all pressing towards, look, we may be at different levels of economic development in Europe and in sub-Saharan Africa, but we all have a stake in this. We need to figure out, with our own policy constructs, at least for a while, how we are going to understand the carbon value in the economy. If that's what happens, this will come, but it'll take time, and we should not, again, we shouldn't park ourselves waiting for that magic day. We should be developing these policy agnostic tools that eventually can provide a basis for that low carbon economy.
I just want to add one story to this. When I started, I did a bipartisan policy initiative on natural climate solutions with Saxby Chambliss. And so I called around to some of my growers in North Dakota that I had developed a long relationship. And I talked to a soybean grower, conservative, clearly a Trump voter. And I said, well, you know, I'd like just some input from you. He said, well, I think we've got to do it. We've got to know. And he said, because I can't just sell my soybeans in this country. And so it goes to exactly what Ernie said. But I think we have to be cautious. You know, we talk about gap accounting. Gap accounting doesn't mean you count every number 2 pencil, right? And so there's got to be a cutoff point at which the tipping point of value added of that additional information will not result in any additional climate, goal achievement. And so that's always the trick. You know, when we talk about regulation and mandates, 80% of the purpose of the regulation can be produced with 20% of the cost. It is the additional 20% that costs the 80%. And the inability of the regulator or the regulating folks to kind of think where's the cutoff point is a point of frustration that I think people who want to move this issue forward need to recognize. So.
And Heidi, I would just add, we've got to figure out, for example, what goodwill means on the balance sheet.
Absolutely.
For example.
You know, what do the intangibles, I mean, on top of what you were saying about state legislatures basically mandating that they not include this, we have investments, state sovereign funds that have said we are not going to invest in anyone that has this as a value. And so the backlash has been kind of ignored and unresponded to, which is why in the previous question I said we need to understand the legitimacy of their argument and then figure out how you're going to appropriately respond.
Can I just add, Rich, one comment, which is not germane to the exact subject here, but Heidi, last time, in your last response, you mentioned the word coalition, which I think is so critical. In fact, I would just say that, and unfortunately, a lot of my colleagues, I think, would fail this test. If you're doing anything that acts to fracture a coalition willing to move ahead in our problems, you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
Greg had also asked how much more headroom there is in voluntary action. I will simply offer, last year we looked at this at CEBA in terms of how much more is there in clean electricity in the United States alone. And we found that there's at least another 175 gigawatts of corporate voluntary commitment just amongst the goals that the Fortune 1000 have set. So 2.5x what we've done today, which is an enormous amount of additional headroom there. I did want to get to this last question though, the interplay around, so this focus is in some sense around enabling corporate voluntary commitments. If we simply had that policy regime, so if we simply had that clean electricity standard and we all had some sense, for example, that all electricity sold in the US economy was gradually heading to zero, would we need all of this? Is it worth doing all this? And I'm curious what folks' thoughts are on whether we should continue focusing on this accounting work, which in some sense is around voluntary, or whether this is also essential in a policy-heavy future, or should we just be all focused on, as Ernie said, building the coalitions and actually doing the hard work to actually get the higher ambition policy passed?
Well, okay, first of all, it's not an or, it's an and. Sure.
That's how we answered every question when I used to be at McKinsey. It was that's a hard thing. You should do both.
Well, but you really have to here, because clearly, if we arrive at the magic land where there's no carbon involved anywhere in the economy, I don't see why I would bother just writing zeros down all the time. But that's a long way off, and we need the tools to help us get there. And this is one of the tools to help us get there. And I would just add that, sitting in this room, we tend to drift towards kind of a U.S.-focused discussion. Come on. The emerging economies, the developing world, India, look, for example, just as one example, which people may not agree with, but look, India doesn't have natural gas to first approximation. It's got a lot of coal. Guess what? They're going to use the coal. for a long time. The question is, how do we make the coal use low carbon? And I guess that's called CCS. And you know, we just got to focus on it's the carbon that we're after, and get the tools in place to address the very different policy environments, the very different economic environments, the health issues, the population displacement issues, et cetera, you know, which are very regional, and yet we have to try to get this low carbon value as something that is globally observed.
I think we have time for one last burning question. I see one right over there.
Hi there. Thank you. My name's Rebecca, and I'm with the Herb Institute at the University of Michigan. I work with students who are future sustainability leaders, and we're talking a lot about the now and what we can do, but what can our students do to be these leaders in this space? I know there's a lot of certifications and education, but what can they do? What can they absorb so that when they go out into this world, they can take it on and be our next generation and hopefully solve the problem? So
in addition to getting accounting degrees, what can they do as
Right,
the hot new climate job?
Right. So I used to be on the advisory board at Herb, which is a great, great graduate school, the management school at the University of Michigan. There is so much they could do. I mean, number one, go into a company and work for the company and help them figure out what's their footprint, how do they bring it back, be part of their marketing and communications, how do they talk about it, not run away from it, be part of a government relations staff. So the number of jobs, despite government, NGOs, corporations, almost every major enterprise of substantial size have sustainability folks now. We are seeing some of those staffs being shrunk at Fortune 100 companies who have built up large. Every financial institution, the field of sustainable investing is still growing. So go in and be an analyst. I mean, your folks and you and your colleagues are the future. And I would say there are unlimited opportunities for you all to help us and move us into the new direction.
Well, I run the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, so it's going to come as no surprise. They have to become politically active, or you are not going to see the change. You know, I deal with students, bright, incredibly smart. They come from all different disciplines at the university. They think that if they're right as a matter of fact and science, that of course, the world will open up and everything will change because they're right, and this is a challenge. They need to develop political skills, and we need to develop an army of climate voters. If voting on the climate had the same cachet as voting on Social Security, trust me, we would have a different outcome in Washington. And so we have lost the momentum on climate voting. We've seen young people become, especially gender divided, have seen them become less willing to talk about these issues about equality and equity and gay rights, and I mean, I could just go through all of the kind of woke categories. And so I think it begins with number one, and this is maybe a story. I was at Harvard at the Institute of Politics there, and a woman came in and she said, a young girl, she was first year, she said, "I don't like you." And I said, okay, a lot of people don't like me. Is it my red hair? And she said, "No, you're against the Green New Deal." And I said, "I've never said I was against a Green New Deal. I've simply asked, what is it?" And so in your advocacy, they need to be prepared to have heard the other side, have dialogue with the other side, and have certainty in their message. And I think that too often it becomes the buzzword or the bumper sticker politically without a lot of substance behind it. Now, obviously, you have a group of students very willing, but also very set in their attitudes and maybe unwilling to listen to the other side. And so what I would say is, you know, political advocacy, building an army of climate voters even at the margins, think about Michigan. If you had 20,000 students who said, we are going to go recruit 2 or 3 other students, making you 60,000 strong, right? And we are going to vote on climate. Do you think the next senator of Michigan's going to listen to those students? Absolutely, because the margins are so small. And so you don't need a lot of political organizing in a lot of states. You just need a commitment and knowledge and a willingness to have tough conversations with people you don't agree with.
We're getting the flashing red light, so it's going to have to be a
Yes,
lightning answer.
It's going to be a lightning answer. Number one, advise the students to not think about what has to be done to reach unachievable goals. Ask them to think about achievable goals, and that's a lot of discussion earlier. And secondly, I think you said Urban Institute, and was that correct? Did I hear that correctly?
Herb, E-herb.
Earth,
Oh,
E-A-R.
okay, fine. Then I withdraw my second comment.
Now everyone is going to leave here wondering what his thoughts were about the Urban Institute. But that is a topic for another time, because we are getting the red light. I want to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation.
Thank
Can
you.
you please join me in a round of applause thanking Heidi and Ernie and Mindy for this terrific trip.